Here's the truth about the gold rush, right now, before anything else. The gold rush was never really about gold. It was about people. It was about hope and greed and heartbreak, all mixed together in a river of mud. And there is one man in this story you need to remember. He was the very first person on earth to hold that gold in his hand. He found it before a single other soul in the whole world knew it was there. You would think a man like that became rich beyond his dreams. You would think his name was written in gold letters in every history book, and that his family lived like kings forever after. He did not, and they did not. What happened to that man is one of the saddest, strangest secrets in American history. We are going to tell you his whole story, every piece of it, but not yet. First, you need to understand how one small, shiny rock, sitting quietly at the bottom of a cold river, turned into a stampede of 500,000 people. You need to feel how it swept up dreamers and families and children, and how it changed the world forever. And you need to see how many of those people it broke. Stay with this story to the very end, because the truth about what happened to the man who found the gold first will break your heart, and once you hear it, you will never think about the gold rush the same way again. We have all seen the pictures. Rough, smiling men in wide hats, kneeling beside a river, holding up a pan full of shining flakes. Old movies with saloons, cowboys, and lucky strikes. A whole legend built around one simple idea, that in California, in the middle of the 19th century, anybody, rich or poor, educated or not, could dig in the dirt for a few months and come out a millionaire. That legend is only half true, and it is the smaller half. The bigger half of the truth is filled with disease, death, broken families, stolen land, and poisoned rivers. It is filled with a quiet, forgotten carpenter and a proud landowner who both ended up with absolutely nothing, while strangers who never touched a single ounce of gold walked away as some of the richest men in the country. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why that happened, and you will never look at an old gold pan the same way again. The spark in the river. It was a cold morning in January of 1848. The sun had not fully risen over the hills of Northern California. A carpenter named James Marshall was building a sawmill on a river called the American River. He worked for a rich landowner named John Sutter, a man who dreamed of building his own private empire in the wilderness. Marshall was checking the water flowing through the mill. He looked down into the shallow water and something caught his eye, a small, dull yellow piece of metal. He picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. He bit it, the way people did back then to test metal. It bent slightly under his teeth. That was a good sign. Real gold is soft. Fake gold is hard. His heart must have pounded. Imagine that feeling. One quiet moment alone by a river and your whole world tilts sideways. He carried the tiny nugget back to camp in his hat, wrapped carefully like a secret already trying to escape. Marshall rushed to tell Sutter. The two men tested the metal again and again. They dropped acid on it. They weighed it against silver. Every test came back the same way. It was gold, real, pure gold, sitting in the dirt of a river that ran straight through Sutter's land. Sutter did not celebrate. He panicked. He knew exactly what this discovery could do. He begged his workers to keep the secret. He needed time to finish his mill, to plant his crops, to protect his land before the world found out. He believed in that quiet moment that he could control what was coming. He could not have been more wrong. Think for a moment about who these two men actually were, because it makes the ending of this story so much harder to bear. John Sutter was not just some random landowner. He was a proud, ambitious man who had come to California years earlier with a dream of building his own little kingdom in the wilderness. He called it New Helvetia, a private colony with farms, workshops, and an actual fort, all built through years of hard work, borrowed money, and sheer stubborn willpower. James Marshall was a quiet, somewhat restless carpenter, a man who had wandered from job to job before finally settling into this one simple task of building a sawmill along a peaceful river. Neither man was searching for gold that morning. They were simply trying to finish an honest piece of construction work. Gold found them, not the other way around, and that small twist of fate would end up shaping the rest of both of their lives in ways neither one of them could have possibly imagined while standing at that quiet riverbank. Secrets like that do not stay secret. Workers whispered to friends. Friends whispered to traders. Traders whispered to sailors. By the spring of 1848, rumors were floating through the dusty streets of San Francisco, then just a small, sleepy town of a few hundred people. Many people did not believe it at first. Gold rumors were common back then, and most of them turned out to be nothing. People shrugged and went back to their normal lives. Then a shopkeeper named Sam Brannan changed everything. Brannan understood something powerful. He did not need to find gold himself to get rich. He only needed everyone else to believe gold was out there. He bought up every shovel, pickaxe, and pan he could find in San Francisco. Then he walked through the streets holding a small bottle filled with gold dust, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" That single moment lit the match. The fire that followed would burn across the entire world. The fever spreads like wildfire. Within days, San Francisco began to empty out. Store owners closed their shops mid-sale and grabbed shovels. Newspaper workers dropped their pens in the middle of writing a story. Ship captains woke up one morning to find their entire crews had vanished overnight, running toward the hills with pans in hand. Soldiers deserted their posts. Preachers left their churches without finishing a sermon. Farmers left their fields half-planted, crops rotting in the sun because there was no one left to harvest them. It did not matter what a person's job was, or how much they were paid, or how stable their life had been. Gold fever did not care about any of that. By the middle of 1848, the news had reached the rest of the country. At first, people in cities like New York and Boston laughed it off as another wild rumor from the frontier. Newspapers printed doubtful little stories about it in the back pages. Then, in December of 1848, President James Polk stood before Congress and confirmed it himself. Gold had truly been found in California in huge quantities. He held up samples in front of lawmakers. That single speech changed everything. If the President of the United States said it was true, it had to be true. The word spread like a fever moving through a crowded room. It reached farms in Ohio, factories in Pennsylvania, fishing villages in Massachusetts. It crossed the ocean to Europe. It reached China, where young men heard whispered stories of Gum San, the Golden Mountain, a place across the sea where a poor man could become rich overnight. It reached Australia. It reached South America. It reached tiny islands in the Pacific. Within one single year, roughly 90,000 people dropped everything in their lives and rushed toward California. Within just a few years, that number would swell past 300,000. Those first arrivals in 1849 earned a nickname that has stuck around for more than 170 years. People still call them the 49ers today, a name borrowed for football teams and cartoon characters, even though most people who say it now have no idea just how much heartbreak sat underneath that friendly-sounding word. The people who came were not all the same. They did not speak the same language, wear the same clothes, or pray to the same God. Miners arrived from Chile, from Peru, from France, from Ireland, from Germany, and from dozens of small villages across southern China. For a brief, strange moment in history, the muddy riverbanks of California became one of the most mixed and diverse places on the entire planet, all because of one shared dream of striking it rich. Sadly, as you will soon see, that mixing of cultures did not always lead to fairness or kindness. It often led to jealousy, fear, and cruelty instead. Think about what that truly meant for a moment. Imagine a young father in Missouri, kissing his wife and children goodbye, promising he would return home rich within the year. Imagine a farmer in China saying goodbye to his elderly parents, not knowing if he would ever see their faces again. Imagine teenagers barely out of childhood, packing a single bag, chasing a dream built entirely on rumors and hope. They called this dream seeing the elephant. It was a phrase people used back then to describe something enormous, thrilling, and dangerous, all at the same time. Something you could never fully picture until you experienced it yourself. Gold was the elephant everyone wanted to see. Newspapers back east printed breathless letters from early arrivals describing nuggets the size of a fist, rivers practically glittering with gold, and ordinary men filling entire buckets in a single afternoon. Most of these stories were wildly exaggerated, stretched thin by distance and excitement until they barely resembled the truth. But by the time those letters reached small towns in Ohio or Georgia, nobody wanted to hear a cautious voice of doubt. People wanted to believe. They needed to believe. For farmers buried in debt, for factory workers trapped in exhausting, low-paying jobs, for young men with no land and no real future waiting for them at home, California sounded less like a gamble and more like a rescue. But almost none of them understood what price they would pay just to get there. The deadly road to riches, getting to California in 1849 was not simple. There were no highways, there were no trains crossing the country yet. There were only 3 brutal choices, and every single one of them could kill you. The first choice was sailing all the way around the tip of South America, around a place called Cape Horn. This voyage could take 5 to 8 months. Ships fought through freezing storms and monstrous waves at the very bottom of the world. Sailors got horribly seasick for weeks at a time. Food supplies rotted in the damp air below deck. Some ships never made it around the Horn at all. They simply vanished into the freezing ocean, and the families waiting back home never received so much as a letter explaining why. The second choice was a shortcut through Panama. Travelers would sail to Panama, cross through thick, steaming jungle on foot or by canoe, and then wait, sometimes for months, for another ship heading north to California. That jungle crossing was deadly in its own way. Mosquitoes carried diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Men who had never been sick a day in their lives collapsed in the heat and never got back up. Graveyards near the Panama crossing filled quickly with hopeful travelers who'd never even reached California's shore. The third choice was the overland route, the wagon trails stretching nearly 2,000 miles across mountains, deserts, and rivers. Families loaded their entire lives into a single wagon and set off walking beside oxen for months at a time. They faced blistering summer heat crossing the Nevada desert with barely enough water to survive. They faced freezing snowstorms trying to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains before winter fully arrived. Cholera, a horrible disease caused by dirty water, swept through wagon trains and could kill a healthy person within a single day. Historians believe that along these trails, 1 out of every 10 travelers died before they ever reached California. Along some of the roughest stretches, graves lined the trail every few hundred yards. Picture a mother walking beside a wagon for 16 hours a day, watching her child grow weaker from a sickness she did not understand, with no doctor for hundreds of miles. Picture a young man burying his own brother in the desert sand, marking the spot with nothing but a small wooden cross, then forcing himself to keep walking west because turning back felt even more impossible than continuing forward. These were not just numbers in a history book. These were real people, with real families, who believed so strongly in a better life that they were willing to risk everything, even their own children's lives, to reach it. Just a few years before the gold rush began, a group of settlers heading toward California, remembered today as the Donner Party, became trapped by early snow while trying to cross those very same mountains. Nearly half of them starved or froze to death before help finally arrived. Every single 49er walking that same trail toward the goldfields knew that story. They had heard it whispered around campfires, told as a warning. And still, thousands upon thousands of them chose to walk that same dangerous path anyway, because the pull of gold felt even stronger than the fear of following in those tragic footsteps. Some travelers wrote letters home describing the trail in heartbreaking detail, describing the smell of dead oxen along the roadside, the sight of abandoned furniture and broken wagon wheels scattered across the desert where families had been forced to lighten their load just to survive another day. Wedding rings, family Bibles, and children's toys were sometimes left behind in the sand, tiny pieces of a life someone had once loved, sacrificed simply so a wagon could roll a little farther west. And for what waited at the end of that terrible journey was not a golden paradise. It was mud, freezing rivers, and brutal, backbreaking labor from sunrise until well after dark. Most miners stood knee-deep in icy water for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, sifting through gravel with frozen, blistered hands. Many developed painful rheumatism that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Food was scarce and outrageously expensive. A single egg could cost what a factory worker back home earned in an entire day. Loneliness crushed many of these men just as hard as the physical labor did. They were thousands of miles from their wives, their children, their parents, their entire former lives. Letters home took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Many miners never saw their families again, not because they died, but because they simply could never afford the journey home, too ashamed to return without the fortune they had promised to bring back. Back home, wives and children waited in a kind of painful limbo, sometimes for years at a time, unsure if a husband or father was alive, sick, rich, or simply gone forever. Some women were left to run entire farms and raise children completely alone, never knowing whether the next letter would bring good news, terrible news, or nothing at all. Entire communities back east came to be filled with what people quietly called gold widows, wives whose husbands had technically not died, but who lived every single day not knowing if they ever would see them again. That kind of uncertainty is its own quiet, grinding kind of heartbreak, one that rarely makes it into the exciting adventure stories told about this era. The hidden cost of gold. Here is a part of the story that most people never learn in school, and it is the darkest chapter of this entire truth. Before white settlers ever arrived searching for gold, California was home to native peoples who had lived on that land for thousands of years. Historians estimate there were roughly 150,000 native people living in California when the gold rush began. Within just 25 years, that number had collapsed to barely 30,000 people. That is not a small tragedy hidden somewhere in the footnotes of history. That is one of the fastest and most devastating population collapses ever recorded in North America. What caused it was not one single thing, but many terrible things happening all at once. Miners flooded onto lands that native families had lived on for generations, without asking permission, without any thought for who already called that land home. Native villages were burned, hunting grounds were destroyed, rivers that native communities depended on for fishing were poisoned with mining chemicals and choked with mud and debris. Violence broke out constantly, and it was rarely equal. Armed militias, some of them even funded by the new California state government itself, hunted down native men, women, and children in organized attacks. Historians today often use the word genocide to describe what happened in California during this period, because the pattern of intentional killing, combined with government support and funding, fits that heartbreaking definition. Diseases brought by the newcomers, sicknesses like smallpox and measles, spread through native communities that had no natural protection against them. Starvation followed close behind, since the miners had destroyed so many of the food sources native families depended on to survive. Children were often taken from their families entirely, forced into labor under laws that technically called it apprenticeship. but that in reality looked disturbingly close to slavery. The land itself suffered terribly too. Miners in the later years of the gold rush turned to a method called hydraulic mining. Giant, powerful hoses blasted entire hillsides apart with high-pressure water, tearing through soil and rock in search of gold buried deep inside. This method could wash away an entire mountainside within just a few years. The mud, dirt, and mining waste created by this process, called sediment, flowed downstream into rivers and valleys. It buried farmland under feet of mud. It clogged rivers so badly that flooding became far worse in nearby towns. Fish populations collapsed because the water became too thick and too poisoned with mercury, a toxic metal miners used to help separate gold from dirt for anything to survive in it. Traces of that mercury pollution dumped into California's rivers and soil more than 170 years ago can still be found in the environment today. The damage from those few frantic years of digging was so severe that some of it may never fully disappear. Whole forests near the mining regions were cut down for timber, used to build shafts, sluices, flumes, and endless miles of wooden pipe carrying water to the mining sites. Hillsides that had stood untouched for thousands of years were stripped bare within a single decade. Wildlife that depended on those forests and clean rivers, deer, salmon, beavers, and countless smaller creatures, either fled the region entirely or simply could not survive the sudden, violent change to their home. In a strange and tragic way, the land itself became one more quiet victim of the gold rush, alongside the native families and the animals who had once called it home. Native families were not the only ones treated unfairly during this period. Miners who had come from China, Mexico, and Chile often worked just as hard as anyone else, sometimes harder, yet they were treated with open hostility by many other miners. In 1850, California's government passed something called the Foreign Miners' Tax, a law that forced miners who were not born in the United States to pay a heavy monthly fee just to keep digging, even on public land that technically belonged to no one. Many Chinese miners paid this unfair tax for years without complaint, quietly enduring insults and violence, simply because the dream of a better life back home still felt worth the pain. Entire mining camps sometimes forced Chinese or Latin American miners off land at gunpoint the moment it looked promising, only for the very same land to be reworked by someone else the following week. This is the part of the truth that gold-covered postcards and adventure movies almost never show you. Behind every glittering nugget pulled from a riverbed, there was a cost paid by people and by land that never agreed to pay it. Winners, losers, and broken dreams. So, after all of that danger, all of that death, and all of that destruction, who actually became rich from the gold rush? The honest answer might surprise you. It was almost never the miners themselves. Historians estimate that out of the hundreds of thousands of people who rushed to California chasing gold, only a very small percentage ever struck it rich. Most miners barely broke even after paying for food, tools, and their brutal journey west. Many others lost everything they had brought with them and went home with empty pockets, or never went home at all. The people who truly grew wealthy from the gold rush were rarely the ones swinging pickaxes in freezing rivers. They were the ones selling supplies to the miners. A young immigrant named Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco hoping to sell fabric to miners for tents and wagon covers. He noticed miners desperately needed pants tough enough to survive constant crouching, digging, and kneeling in rough rock. He began making sturdy work pants reinforced with metal rivets at the stress points. Those pants eventually became the blue jeans that people all over the world still wear today. Levi Strauss became far wealthier, selling pants to miners than almost any miner ever became digging for gold. Sam Brannan, the very same shopkeeper who ran through the streets shouting about gold, became one of California's first millionaires, not by mining a single ounce of gold, but by selling shovels, pans, and supplies at wildly inflated prices to desperate, hopeful men. Businesses selling food, clothing, tools, and transportation boomed. Banks were founded specifically to handle the sudden flow of gold, including a small company that would eventually grow into the massive financial institution known today as Wells Fargo. A young chocolate maker named Domingo Ghirardelli tried mining for a short time, failed to find much of anything, and instead opened a small shop selling coffee, chocolate, and supplies to hungry, exhausted miners. That little shop eventually grew into one of the most famous chocolate companies in the entire country, a company that still sells chocolate near San Francisco's waterfront to this very day. Once again, the person who quietly sold comfort and small pleasures to miners ended up far wealthier than almost any miner who actually swung a pickaxe in the freezing mud. Mining towns themselves grew into strange, chaotic little worlds almost overnight. Wooden buildings went up in a matter of days, housing saloons, gambling halls, and general stores that charged unbelievably high prices for the most basic supplies. Women in these towns were rare, and the few who did arrive often ran boarding houses, laundries, or restaurants, quietly building small fortunes of their own by feeding and caring for thousands of lonely, homesick men. Some of these women became far wealthier and far more respected within their communities than most of the miners ever became. Meanwhile, the miners themselves often lived in absolute misery. Many crowded into filthy, disease-ridden mining camps with no real law enforcement, no doctors, and no safety of any kind. Fights broke out constantly over land claims. Robbery and violence were common, and there was rarely anyone official around to stop it. Alcohol abuse and gambling ruined countless men who had once been hopeful fathers and husbands back home. By the mid-1850s, the easy surface-level gold that could simply be scooped up in a pan had largely run out. Getting to the gold that remained required expensive industrial machinery, big companies, and organized labor, not lone prospectors with a pan and a dream. The romantic image of a single lucky miner striking it rich overnight had mostly become a myth, even while the gold rush was still technically happening. Thousands of men who had left their families with grand promises of returning home wealthy instead returned home broken, sick, and empty-handed. Some never returned home at all, too humiliated by their failure, or too weakened by disease and hardship to survive the return journey. Others simply drifted away entirely, wandering to new mining rushes in Nevada, Colorado, or Montana, forever chasing that same golden feeling one more time, refusing to admit that the dream they had risked everything for had already quietly slipped away from them. It is a painfully human thing to do, chasing one more chance rather than accepting a loss, and thousands of 49ers spent the rest of their lives doing exactly that, one disappointing gold camp after another. The dream that pulled so many people across oceans and deserts had quietly turned into one of the greatest disappointments in American history for the vast majority of people who chased it. And that brings us back to the two men at the very center of this entire story, the men who could have easily become the two richest human beings on the entire planet. The truth revealed. Remember the promise from the very beginning of this story. We told you the truth about what happened to the man who found gold first would break your heart. Now, finally, here it is. James Marshall, the carpenter who first spotted that shining metal in the river, never became wealthy from his discovery. Not even close. Once news of the gold spread, miners flooded onto the very land where Marshall had made his discovery. They did not care that he was the man who found it first. They pushed him aside completely, treating him as just another face in an endless crowd of prospectors. Marshall tried mining gold himself for a while, but he had terrible luck and barely found anything at all. People began to believe, foolishly, that Marshall carried some kind of curse and that any land he touched would refuse to produce gold for him personally, even while it produced fortunes for everyone standing right next to him. He drifted between odd jobs for years afterward, always broke, always overlooked. Eventually, the California state government granted him a small pension in recognition of his historic discovery, but it was tiny, barely enough to survive on, and it was eventually cut off entirely. James Marshall, the man who quite literally started the California gold rush, the event that generated well over $2 billion in today's money, died poor, alone, and largely forgotten in the year 1885. He was buried near the very spot where he first found that piece of gold. Years later, the state finally built a large bronze statue of him there, pointing proudly toward the river. It stands as a strange and painful monument, honoring in death the man the world had almost completely ignored while he was still alive to feel that pain. And what about John Sutter, the wealthy landowner who tried so desperately to keep the secret and protect his land? His fate was, in some ways, even more heartbreaking. The moment gold fever exploded, thousands of strangers stormed straight through Sutter's private land, completely ignoring his ownership. They slaughtered his cattle for food without paying him a cent. They stole his tools and equipment. They trampled his crops flat into the mud. His own workers abandoned their jobs immediately to search for gold themselves, leaving his entire operation collapsing around him. Sutter's grand dream of building his own private empire in California, a dream he had worked his entire life to construct, was completely destroyed within just a few short years, torn apart by the very discovery made on his own property. He spent the rest of his life desperately petitioning the United States government for compensation for everything that had been stolen or destroyed. He traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. multiple times, begging Congress for help. He was consistently denied. John Sutter died in 1880 in a hotel room in Washington, still waiting for a payment that would never come, still hoping for a justice that never arrived. Picture James Marshall in his final years. An old man, thin and tired, walking through the same hills where he had once made history. Strangers sometimes recognized his name and asked him to tell the story of that famous morning by the river again and again, as if he were some kind of traveling performer instead of a human being who had simply had one strange stroke of luck in an otherwise difficult life. He would tell the story politely, then walk back to his small, plain home alone with empty pockets, while men who had heard his story went off to build fortunes he never shared in. Imagine how strange that must have felt, to be famous and penniless at the very same time, to know that your own two hands had unlocked more wealth than almost anyone in American history had ever seen, while your own stomach still went hungry some nights. Picture John Sutter as well, sitting in that small hotel room in Washington, D.C., an ocean and a continent away from the fort and the fields he had built with his own sweat and money. Picture him writing letter after letter to government officials who rarely even bothered to respond. Picture the quiet humiliation of a once proud, ambitious man reduced to begging for scraps of the very fortune that had been carved directly out of his own land. He had dreamed of building an empire that would carry his name forward for generations. Instead, his name survives mostly as a footnote, a place on a map, a name attached to someone else's incredible luck. That is the real, complete truth about the gold rush. The two men who were closer to that gold than any other human beings on Earth, the two men who by all logic should have become the wealthiest people in the entire country, instead died poor, forgotten, and heartbroken. Meanwhile, a shopkeeper selling shovels and a tailor selling sturdy pants became legends of American business. The gold rush promised the entire world that anyone, absolutely anyone, could become rich overnight simply by showing up and getting lucky. In reality, it built extraordinary fortunes for a small handful of clever businessmen, while it crushed the health, the families, the cultures, and even the lives of countless others who believed in that shining promise. It is a story that still feels painfully familiar today. Think about how many modern dreams follow this exact same shape. A new opportunity appears, whether it is a stock, a piece of land, or some brand new invention, and the whole world seems to rush toward it at once, certain that this time everyone will win. Yet history quietly repeats itself again and again. The people who rush in first, full of hope and hard work, are often not the ones who end up holding the reward. It is usually the people standing just off to the side, selling tools, taking fees, or watching patiently from a safe distance who end up walking away with the greatest fortune. This story reminds us that the loudest, most exciting promises are not always the ones that come true, and that the people who truly deserve credit and reward are not always the ones who end up receiving it. Hard work and hope are precious things, but this story shows us they are sadly never a guarantee of fairness. Think, too, about everyone else this story touched. Think about the native families whose entire world was torn apart within a single generation, their rivers poisoned, their villages burned, their population reduced by nearly 80% in barely 25 years. Think about the exhausted immigrants who crossed oceans only to be taxed, insulted, and pushed off land simply because of where they were born. Think about the thousands of unnamed travelers buried in unmarked graves along desert trails, their own personal dreams ending quietly in the sand, never even reaching the gold fields they had sacrificed everything to find. The gold rush is remembered today as an exciting, adventurous chapter of American history, full of daring dreamers and lucky strikes. But underneath that shiny surface lies a much heavier, much sadder truth, one made of broken families, poisoned land, stolen lives, and two forgotten men who deserve so much better than what history quietly gave them. So the next time you see an old photograph of a smiling miner holding up a pan full of gold, remember James Marshall, kneeling quietly beside that cold river in 1848, holding the very first piece of gold anyone had ever found there. Remember John Sutter, writing desperate letters nobody answered. Remember that their lonely, forgotten endings are the real hidden truth this entire legendary story has been quietly hiding all along.